I spent months planning my parents' 40th anniversary party. They smiled through it all. Only later I found the papers, hidden in a drawer. I thought they were happy, until I learned the truth they'd kept from us for years. Growing up, my parents' marriage was the anchor of our family. Steady, reliable like the oak tree in the center of my grandparents' old backyard. No matter how messy life got, college breakups, lost jobs, those late-night emergency phone calls, they were there together. That's why, when their 40th anniversary started creeping up, I felt like it was my duty to make it something special. Not just dinner at their favorite diner or a quick, congratulations card like we had for the 35th. No, this had to be big. Let's go all out, I told my sister Julia one evening over coffee. You think they'll go for it? She asked, stirring her cup absently. Why wouldn't they? 40 years, Jules. Not everyone gets there. She nodded, smiling. Hey, let's make it unforgettable. I threw myself into planning like it was a second full-time job. Booked a charming local vineyard that could host up to 200 guests. Hired a photographer who specialized in candid family moments. Found a caterer who promised to recreate my parents' wedding menu. Prime rib, mashed potatoes, green beans, almondine. I even started gathering photos and old letters for a memory table. Julia helped too, hunting down old friends, organizing playlists of songs they danced to in the 80s. Our brother Chris, always the least reliable, actually pitched in money without being asked. Everyone seemed excited. Everyone but my parents themselves. At first I chalked it up to them being low-key people. They were never the center of attention type. Dad would always grumble through birthday parties and Mom hated when people made a fuss. But something about this felt different. Whenever I tried to get them involved, hey, do you guys want to pick out a song for your dance? Or, which friends should we definitely invite? They'd either wave me off or say, you choose, honey. Sometimes I caught Mom staring out the window during our planning sessions, fiddling with her wedding band. And Dad? He was busy. Always busy. Working late. Helping a neighbor with his roof. Golfing. I brushed it aside. Told myself they were just overwhelmed. 40 years is a long time. Maybe it stirred up weird emotions. One night, about a month before the big day, I stopped by their house unannounced, arms full of catering sample menus and floral arrangement ideas. I found them sitting in the living room side by side but not touching, the TV flickering in the background. Hey, I said too cheerily. I have some ideas to run by you guys. Mom smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Dad muted the TV, clearing his throat. That's great, sweetie, Mom said. But, maybe keep it simple? Yeah, Dad agreed. No need to go crazy. I laughed nervously. It's not crazy. It's your 40th. You deserve the world. They exchanged a look, quick, loaded, then turned back to me with practiced smiles. Whatever you think, Dad said. We trust you, Mom added. I should have seen it then. Should have realized that trust you really meant we don't have the heart to tell you the truth. But I didn't. I just kept planning. The RSVPs flooded in. Old family friends I hadn't seen in years. Distant cousins. My parents' college roommates. Even Dad's old boss from the manufacturing plant, the one who gave him his first job after the army, wrote back a warm, wouldn't miss it for the world. I booked extra chairs. I upgraded the catering package. I ordered a giant custom cake shaped like a tree, with 40 years strong written in delicate gold script. Julia joked that it was turning into a royal wedding. They're gonna be so overwhelmed, she said. It'll be beautiful. And I believed her. Every time doubt crept in, those small cracks I tried so hard to ignore, I pictured my parents' faces when they walked into the vineyard. I imagined Mom gasping at the twinkling lights strung through the oak trees, Dad wiping a tear as he hugged each guest. I imagined laughter. Speeches. Maybe even a slow dance. I imagined a family whole and solid and unshakable. 2 weeks before the party, I went over to drop off the final seating chart. Dad wasn't home. Golf again. Mom answered the door looking different. Tired. Her makeup was off. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. Hey Mom, I said, holding up the chart like a prize. Final version. Come in, she said softly. I followed her into the kitchen, laid the chart on the counter and started explaining where everyone would sit. She barely glanced at it. Instead, she sat down at the table, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee. Sweetheart, she said finally, her voice low. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated. What would you do, she said slowly, if you found out something that changed everything you thought you knew? I blinked. Depends on what it was, I guess. She nodded like she expected that. Like she already knew the answer wasn't simple. Never mind, she said after a moment. Forget I asked. I laughed awkwardly. Mom. Way to drop a philosophical bomb on me. She smiled, small and sad. Just promise me something? Anything. Whatever happens, she said, remember that we love you. Something tightened in my chest. You guys aren't sick or anything, are you? I joked weakly. No, she said quickly. Nothing like that. Then what? She didn't say. She just hugged me tighter than usual when I left. I walked to my car feeling like I'd missed something huge. And I had. I just didn't know it yet. The days leading up to the party became a blur of last-minute details. Final head counts. Floor's confirmations. Printing the program with a special section labeled, A Love Story. Mark and Elaine, 40 years strong. It felt like building a cathedral out of matchsticks. Fragile, desperate, with the constant feeling that it might all come crashing down if I breathed wrong. I buried myself in tasks to push away the lingering unease. I wasn't ready to dig into the questions Mom had planted in my head. But the universe had other plans. 3 days before the event, Julia called me in the middle of the afternoon. Can you meet me? She said without preamble. Is everything okay? Come, please. An hour later, I found myself sitting across from her at the small coffee shop near her work. She looked pale, like she hadn't slept. She pushed a manila envelope across the table toward me. I didn't know if I should show you, she said. But you deserve to know. Inside were copies of court filings. I stared at them, my brain refusing to register the bold black letters staring back at me. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Filed 5 months ago. Mark Davis and Elaine Davis. My parents. I looked up at Julia, heart pounding. Is this real? I found it by accident, she whispered. I had to get something from Mom's desk. It was there. My mouth went dry. Maybe it's a mistake. I don't know, maybe they changed their minds. Julia just shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. Why wouldn't they tell us? I asked, voice breaking. I don't know. The weight of betrayal settled on my chest like wet cement. We were planning a celebration of something that didn't even exist anymore. Or maybe, I thought bitterly, it had never really existed the way we believed. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past few months through a new, brutal lens. The sidelong glances. The evasions. Mom fiddling with her wedding band. Dad spending more and more time away. They hadn't just been being low-key. They had been hiding the death of their marriage in plain sight. And we, Julia, Chris, me, had been unwitting accomplices, building a monument to a lie. The worst part was I still didn't know why. 2 days before the party, I met with the photographer, a soft-spoken woman named Carly. Still good for 6 p.m. set up? She asked, tapping her tablet. Yeah, I said distractedly. Everything's still on. Your parents must be so excited. They are, I lied automatically. Carly hesitated. Not my business, she said carefully, but sometimes big events bring up a lot of emotions. If they seem overwhelmed, it's okay. It's normal. I nodded, unsure if I wanted to laugh or cry. If only it were that simple. The night before the party, Julia and I met up again. We sat on her front porch, wrapped in blankets against the cooling spring air, sipping wine straight from the bottle like teenagers. Do we say something? She asked. About what? I said dully. About the divorce. The word hung between us like smoke. I shook my head. It's not our place. If they want to pretend for one more night, let them. Julia stared at her wine. It's not fair. None of this is. We sat in silence, the weight of it all pressing down. Promise me, Julia said eventually, that no matter what happens tomorrow, we stick together. Always. She leaned her head against my shoulder. We stayed like that for a long time, waiting for the inevitable. The morning of the party dawned warm and impossibly bright, as if mocking the storm brewing beneath our family's perfect facade. I woke up to a dozen messages from vendors, last-minute questions about arrival times, floral placements, lighting details. I answered them all mechanically, barely tasting the coffee I brewed strong enough to strip paint. Julia and I met early at the vineyard. She wore a deep green dress and flats, her face pale despite the warm sunshine. "Today's the day," she said without enthusiasm. "Yep," I replied, tightening the knot of my tie. The venue was stunning. Rows of tables set under sweeping oak trees, tiny white lights woven through the branches, tables glimmering with crystal glasses and pale blue linens. Looked exactly like the Pinterest board I had slaved over for months. And yet it felt wrong. Too shiny. Too brittle. Like one wrong word would shatter the entire scene into a million pieces. Guests started arriving in waves, laughing and hugging, their voices rising like a tide. I plastered on my best host smile, accepting compliments on the decorations, the food, the incredible job I'd done. "They must be so proud of you," one of Dad's old co-workers said, clapping me on the back. "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. Grandma Helen, Mom's mother, cornered me near the welcome table. "You did good, sweetheart," she said, squeezing my hand. Then more quietly, "No matter what happens." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She just smiled sadly and patted my cheek before drifting away. I stood there, heart pounding, her words echoing in my head. No matter what happens. Julia found me near the memory table, where photos of Mom and Dad's life together smiled out from golden frames. "They're here," she said simply. I turned. They walked toward us hand in hand, both dressed impeccably, Mom in a pale lavender dress, Dad in a crisp navy suit. From a distance they looked like the perfect couple. Up close you could see the strain. The stiffness in Dad's smile. The way Mom's hand trembled slightly when she waved at a distant cousin. They hugged me, posed for photos, laughed at jokes. It was all a performance. A beautiful, heartbreaking performance. Dinner passed in a blur of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. The speeches began. Chris went first, delivering a bumbling but sweet toast about commitment and weathering storms together. Julia followed, her voice tight as she spoke about love that lasts. And then it was my turn. I stood, heart hammering against my ribs, staring out at a sea of faces that blurred together. 40 years, I began, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. That's more than a milestone. It's a legacy. I talked about growing up under the shelter of their love, about the example they set, about the lessons they taught us. Loyalty, perseverance, forgiveness. As I spoke, I saw Mom blink rapidly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Dad stared at the floor. I raised my glass. To Mark and Elaine. May the roots you've planted continue to grow, even when the seasons change. There was a pause, then polite clapping, some real, some forced. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly under the table. The dinner rolled on, but the atmosphere had shifted, heavy now, expectant. Like everyone was waiting for something to happen. And deep down so was I. It came during the cake cutting. We had set up a small microphone so Mom and Dad could say a few words. Simple thank you. Maybe a quick story. Dad approached the mic first, cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steady but empty. "It means a lot." He stepped aside and Mom took his place. She stared out at the crowd for a long moment. And then she said, "I'm so grateful to see so many faces we love." Another pause. 40 years is a long time, she continued, her voice wavering. Long enough to know that love changes. That people change. I held my breath. "But no matter what," she said, her eyes shining, "family remains." A murmur rippled through the guests. Dad shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his cufflinks. Mom smiled, small, fragile, and stepped down. The band struck up a soft, sentimental tune. And somehow the night staggered on. Afterward, as guests trickled out, Julia and I sat together under one of the big oak trees, watching the lights sway in the breeze. "That felt like a goodbye," Julia whispered. Because it was. I leaned my head back against the trunk, staring up at the stars just beginning to pierce the dark sky. "You think they'll tell everyone?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. Not yet." We sat in silence for a long time. "At least we know," Julia said finally. "At least we can stop pretending." I closed my eyes, the weight of it all settling deep in my bones. But even then, even with everything we knew, we still didn't know the whole story. The vineyard looked deserted by the time we finally gathered our things to leave. Staff buzzed quietly as they dismantled tables and boxed up leftover cake, the fairy lights overhead flickering in the cooling night breeze. Julia and I packed up the photo displays in silence. I glanced over at Mom and Dad, who stood a few feet away talking to Grandma Helen and Uncle Rick. Their faces were tight, guarded. Smiles stretched like rubber bands about to snap. Something was coming. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The next morning the aftermath began. Texts flooded the family group chat. Amazing night. Best party ever. Such a beautiful tribute to true love. I stared at my screen, feeling like an imposter in my own family. Chris sent a message too. Mom and Dad seemed a little off. You guys notice? Julia replied quickly. Maybe they were just overwhelmed. I said nothing. Because how do you explain to someone that the fairy tale they're clinging to is already ashes? That evening I drove to my parents' house. I didn't call first. I needed answers and I couldn't wait for polite openings. The house looked the same as always from the outside. Neatly trimmed lawn, American flag waving gently from the porch. But inside the air was heavy, thick with unspoken words. Mom answered the door, still in her pajamas even though it was almost dinner. Hey honey, she said, stepping aside to let me in. Dad sat on the couch watching the news with the volume turned low. He barely glanced at me. We need to talk, I said. Mom flinched slightly. Dad muted the TV. What about? He asked too casually. I took a deep breath. The divorce. Silence. Mom looked down at her hands. Dad sighed, rubbing his jaw. Finally Mom spoke. We didn't want to ruin the party, she said quietly. We didn't want to ruin everything you did. How long? I asked, though Julia and I already knew. We filed in March, Dad said. Separately. Separately. He hesitated. Mom looked up, eyes brimming. I filed, she said. Your father, he didn't know. The floor seemed to tilt under me. What? I filed for divorce, Mom repeated, her voice trembling. I didn't tell him until after everything was in motion. I stared at them, my mouth dry. Dad's face was a study in defeat. I thought we were managing, he said bitterly. I didn't know it was that bad. It wasn't, Mom whispered. Until it was. The room spun. So all this time while I'd been stringing lights and arranging flowers, they had been trapped in a silent war neither of them had fully declared. Why? I croaked. Mom wiped her eyes. It wasn't one thing. It was years. Little cuts that never healed. Things we never talked about. We stayed for you kids, Dad said, his voice hard. Mom flinched again. That's not fair, she whispered. Isn't it? I left without another word. Got in my car, drove aimlessly through familiar streets that felt suddenly alien. The houses, the parks, the schools. All the landmarks of a life built on the assumption that some things were unshakable. 40 years. 40 years of birthdays and soccer games and family vacations. And somewhere along the way love had rotted from the inside out. That night Julia called. Did you talk to them? Yeah, I said, my voice hoarse. And? It's worse than we thought. I told her everything. About the secret filing. About Dad's shock. Oh my God, she whispered. They weren't even on the same page. They weren't even reading the same book, I said. We sat in stunned silence together, the line buzzing softly between us. Finally Julia said, what do we do now? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that everything we thought we knew was a lie. And the real truth? The real truth was still waiting for us. The next few days blurred together in a haze of half-hearted text messages and cancelled family dinners. Julia and I kept in close contact, orbiting each other like planets that had lost their sun. Chris stayed oblivious, or maybe he chose to be. I envied him in a bitter sort of way. I couldn't stop thinking about Mom's words. Little cuts that never healed. What were they? What had we missed? Or maybe, a darker thought crept in, what had we chosen to ignore? It was Julia who finally pushed us toward the truth. I can't do this, she said over the phone. Pretending everything's fine. We need to know. Know what? I asked wearily. What actually happened? I didn't argue. So 2 days later we sat Mom down in her kitchen. The same kitchen where she used to make our Halloween costumes, where we did homework while she stirred spaghetti sauce, where life had felt simple. It felt like standing on a fault line now, just waiting for the ground to crack open. Mom made tea she didn't drink, Julia spoke first. We know about the divorce, she said gently. But we need to understand. Mom folded her hands neatly on the table, staring at them like they belonged to someone else. It started a long time ago, she said finally. She told us about the loneliness. How Dad had thrown himself into work after Chris was born, building his business from scratch. How she had raised us mostly alone, smiling through PTA meetings and birthday parties while feeling like a ghost in her own home. He wasn't a bad man, she said, voice shaking. He just stopped seeing me. There were betrayals too. Not the kind you could point to in a courtroom. No affairs, no scandal. But coldness. Dismissed dreams. Broken promises. I kept thinking it would get better, Mom whispered. After the kids were older. After retirement. After something. Julia wiped her eyes silently. And then, Mom said, her voice dropping even lower, I found the bank statements. I frowned. Bank statements. She nodded. 3 years ago. She had found an account Dad had opened without telling her. Large transfers. Hidden savings. Money siphoned from their joint accounts little by little over the years. I confronted him, she said. He said it was just in case. For emergencies. Her laugh was small and bitter. Emergency meaning, what? I asked, already knowing the answer. In case he wanted out, Mom said simply. The world tilted again. Dad had been planning his exit for years. Quietly. Patiently. I stayed, Mom said. For you. For the image. For everything we built. Until you couldn't anymore, Julia whispered. Mom nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. We left her house in silence. Julia drove. I stared blankly out the window. He was going to leave her first, Julia said finally. I nodded. And when he didn't, she whispered, she had to do it. It wasn't a matter of who hurt who more. It was a death by 1,000 cuts administered by both sides. And we, their children, had been collateral damage. That night I went back through old family photos. Snapshots of vacations, holidays, school events. I looked closer. At the way Mom always seemed to be smiling alone. At how Dad often stood slightly apart, arms folded. At the distance we had been trained not to see. We had built an entire mythology around them. The perfect marriage, the unbreakable bond. But it was just that. A myth. A story we told ourselves because the truth was too complicated, too painful. Too real. The final blow came a week later. Chris called, his voice tight with anger. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded. We didn't know everything, I said lamely. I had to hear it from Uncle Rick. I closed my eyes, feeling the ground shift beneath me again. I'm sorry, I said. We were trying to protect you. Chris laughed, bitter and sharp. Protect me? Or protect yourselves? The line went dead. I sat there for a long time staring at the blank screen, realizing that the aftershocks of the truth would ripple through all of us for a long, long time. There was no going back. Only forward. Through the wreckage. Toward something new. Something honest. Even if it hurt. Time has a strange way of smoothing the edges of even the sharpest memories. Weeks passed. The calls slowed down. The angry texts faded into polite silence. Family dinners became optional, and then non-existent. It was like a once proud house quietly condemned, left to collapse without ceremony. But somewhere in the wreckage, new foundations began to take root. Julia and I started meeting up regularly, no longer out of obligation but choice. We stopped talking about fixing things. We started talking about the future. Not the sanitized, perfect family future we once believed in. But something smaller. Quieter. Realer. We decided to host Thanksgiving together that year. Just the two of us and maybe Chris if he decided he could forgive us. We laughed at how bad we were at cooking turkey. We planned a menu that included pizza because why not? It wasn't the future we had imagined growing up. But it was ours. Mom moved into a small condo downtown. Nothing fancy but bright and clean with a little balcony filled with plants she never had time for when we were kids. She invited us over for dinner a few weeks after she settled in. No big speeches. No awkward family rituals. Just pasta and garlic bread and a quiet sort of peace. She looked lighter. Sadder maybe. But lighter. Dad, he stayed in the old house for a while then eventually put it up for sale. I heard from him sporadically. Texts about football games. Emails with links to bad jokes. Nothing about the past. Nothing about the future. And somehow that was okay. Not everything has to be resolved neatly. Some things are just endured. Chris came around eventually. He showed up at our chaotic Thanksgiving looking sheepish, holding a store-bought pie. We didn't grill him. We didn't apologize again. We just hugged him and handed him a plate. Family, after all, isn't about pretending everything's perfect. It's about showing up even when it isn't. Especially when it isn't. Sometimes late at night I still think about the anniversary party. The lights strung through the trees. The sound of laughter like glass about to shatter. The look on Mom's face when she said, 40 years is a long time. It was a funeral and a celebration all at once, and we hadn't even known it. But maybe some things have to break so that better things can grow. Not bigger things. Not flashier things. Just better. Truer. Today when I think of my parents, I don't picture them as the golden couple we all once pretended they were. I see them as people. Flawed. Lonely. Doing the best they could with what they had. And somehow that makes me love them more, not less. Because real love, the kind that matters, isn't about perfection. It's about forgiveness. It's about acceptance. It's about seeing someone clearly and loving them anyway. Even when they're broken. Especially when they're broken. I don't know what the future holds for any of us. But I know this. We survived. We adapted. We grew. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.